Greetings, and I would just like to make a short introduction to the next video essay. Normally, I just release the video essay as a reading and I don't talk about it or give an introduction. On this particular essay, I thought I would prefer to make a short introduction. The essay which follows this introduction as an audio reading is called Neo-Nihilism and Transmutation. And in the essay, I begin by talking about how the historian Oswald Spengler, talked about the decline of the West, which for now has been happening in his terms for a century, and how that's a cyclic pattern. And also, he calls it the winter decay. And about in these times of decay, there's a rise of vulgarity. And normally nihilism is this philosophy of kind of life is without meaning and purpose. And I talk about the English philosopher Colin Wilson has talked about this feeling of angst about 50 years ago in an essay or a work of philosophy, and he referred to the insignificance fallacy, how people feel themselves to be insignificant. But it's a fallacy. It's not true, but there's a feeling of this because people feel overwhelmed. And in this overwhelming context of forces, people feel insignificant. And I feel that that is part of what is being pushed upon us now as a narrative. Especially, for example, I mentioned the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who famously has talked about majority of humans becoming useless eaters, and that we will become irrelevant, an irrelevant class in the future, because people will lose purpose and meaning. And the only seeming solution to this being offered by the consensus narrative is a technologized future. And in this, I bring up the idea of neo-nihilism. Neo-nihilism is the modern form of nihilism, where before people had a sense of meaninglessness in the world, but there was still some larger bodies of truths that people could react against. I don't believe in that truth. I don't accept it. For me, there's nihilism. But with a breakdown of truths into a whole spluttering of relative truths, and I've talked about in previous work my idea of what I've talked about, the consensus reality meltdown. So with the breakdown of these consensus truth narratives, which were larger relative truths, but still a kind of support of larger truths that people related to and had terms of reference to. Now there's a kind of complete dissolution of any kind of support structure of larger truths or relative truths. And even the smaller truths now are breaking down into complete fallacies, because we're living in a post-truth world and deep fakes, etc. So this is a stage of complete uncertainty, with whereas previously, if people felt afloat, they could still cling on to the driftwood to some extent. But now there is no driftwood. There's just flotsam and jetsam. So we're in a state of neo-nihilism, or as the philosopher Gurdjieff would say, you're pouring from emptiness into the void. And I see this as part of the pull into deeper materialism, away from the life of the inner spirit, the life of being of the individual, externalized projection into complete materialism. Now, the reason I make this video is, I said, because I want to point out that this vision of neo-nihilism, whilst being quite bleak, is not the vision that I feel that we're going towards. I feel it's where we're going if we don't change our ways. And I think that there's an interesting difference between, and this has been discussed before, and I was discussing it with my friends previously. There's a difference between prediction and prophecy. A prediction is usually based on current trends, that if this is going on now and it continues, we predict this to happen. It's a continuation of trends. Much of what our forecasting, our social futures forecasting is based on that. Now, prophecy is when, some people come forward and say, um, this is going to come about in the future unless we change our ways and change our fate or our destiny. We change our path. And the point of prophecy is that a genuine prophet, if it's a negative prophecy, they don't want that prophecy to materialize. They give a warning so that prophecy can be changed. So they want to be proven wrong by changing the end point. So whereas the technological world, the dominant narratives are trying to predict the future for us by saying, this is where we're going. Technology is taking us there. Technology is going to automate the industry and make people lose their jobs. So people will lose their purpose and they'll become lost in irrelevancy. That's their prediction. They want to make it happen. And it's going to happen if we buy into that prediction. Whereas the human prophecy can be, well, we've got a different future. And we have to bring that about to make sure that the predicted future does not happen. So we don't wish to be pulled into deep materialism. There is an alternative. That alternative is going to be more of an organic future where we realize that technology is tools that we can use to facilitate the humanness, the human being, or the human becoming, but it doesn't substitute the human. So that's why in the essay I talk about neo-nihilism and transmutation, because neo-nihilism or nihilism, the state of nihilism, can be a state that triggers an awareness that nihilism is a situation that catalyzes us into a different response, a different action, a different form or way of moving into the future. And at some point, nihilism may be necessary to make us aware of the flawed predicament of our situation. Is that if we don't change where we're heading towards the predicted technologized future of neo-nihilism, loss of meaning and purpose, where we will feel insignificant. But going back to Colin Wilson, insignificance is a fallacy because we have all the tools we need within us. And so we can steer away and use this as the catalyst into transmutation and into a very human-centric future with human values. So I want the reading or the listening of this essay to show where we could be heading if we follow the predictive programming of the dominant narratives. But in fact, within that predictive programming, we will find the triggers, the activation, the nudges necessary to utilize that situation into a transmutation, into a collapse of the predicted program future, into a different future that we can prophesy, not allow it to be prophesied for us by the predictive programmers. And there's that line, great line, which I can't remember where it comes from. I think it came from a film in the 80s saying that human beings always show their best when they're at their worst. So just because the situation seems dire or seems quite dark, this is not a reason to feel dark or to be tied into that energy, but to realize that it's a necessary, or it's the context of our situation that is allowing us to respond to it in a certain way, whereby our fate and destiny can be chosen for a different path. And I would like to share that for any reader or listener to bear in mind as they go into the next essay that I'm offering, neo-nihilism and transmutation. So thanks for listening for that, and let's continue. Cheers. Yes, the world is an illusion, but truth is always being shown there. Idris Shah. A world of appearances has been in the making for a long time, much longer than the passing zeitgeists of various ideologies. Only that in each age, such appearances take on designated forms. And yet the more detached from reality is the age, the greater is the sense of abstractness, and thus meaninglessness or nihilism. The spectre of nihilism is but the head of a larger creature that represents a broader state of the human condition. The historian Oswald Spengler noted that nihilism begins when the vulgar rises and becomes more widespread than the decent elements in society. Spengler also famously announced a century ago that the Western world is ending, and we are witnessing the final season, the winter, of its civilizational decline. If we are to believe Spengler, then the Western world has been in decline for a solid 100 years now. And yet, for many people, the world has never seemed more satisfying, with access to so much more content-rich lifestyles and social satisfiers. Yet perhaps it is more the case that over the last decades, just enough of a trickle of meaning and purpose was provided by worldly living, so that the spectre of meaninglessness has been kept at bay. Now, however, it would seem that the natives are becoming restless. And not just the natives of the West are becoming restless, but globally. Spengler may have been correct in surmising that the Western world has been in decline for the past century or more. Certainly, in our current times, the geopolitical Western bloc is fast losing its power base. Yet it seems apparent that something larger is in operation. A cyclic decline, perhaps. There is certainly an energetic shift noticeable across the planet, with increased dissonance, unease, anxiety, trauma, depression, nervousness, and more. Some of these conditions could be put down to a correspondence in the Earth's decreasing magnetic fields and the increase in influx of solar and cosmic radiation. However, a grander psychic imbalance is in play through humanity's collective psychology, and questions of meaning and purpose are arising. The English philosopher Colin Wilson believed that modern existentialism, the alienation, nihilism, and boredom of modern life, results from what he called a fallacy of insignificance. In other words, a feeling that the human being is nothing and has no role or true place in the world. Further, that the human sense of insignificance is not only a grand fallacy, but that it is being promoted by increased materialism, by hypermaterialism. Yet matters have changed dramatically in the world since Wilson produced his prognosis more than 50 years ago. Recently, Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari has been announcing that the immediate future holds little hope for a new underclass of, quote, irrelevant and useless people. In previous centuries, says Harari, people revolted against exploitation, oppression, tyranny, etc. Now, they fear becoming irrelevant. Huge numbers of individuals will find themselves living in a society that doesn't need them anymore. It is a harder battle to struggle against irrelevance, as there is nothing tangible to cling to or to reassure you against the encroaching insignificance other than your inner or innate sense of self. This leads to a psychological state of nihilism, for nihilism is ultimately a question of truth, a truth about oneself and how a person feels themselves to be within the experience of physical life. Our external lives are filled with reams of relative truths, from scientific to religious and the philosophic. Modern life has shifted from a position of overarching, systemic, educated objectivities to a splattering of individual subjectivities. Whatever truths were peddled as part of the pre-existing consensus narratives, religion, science, etc., are undergoing a vast refurbishment, whilst their replacements do not seem to be arriving anytime soon. Almost every aspect of modern life has become questionable. Skepticism and disbelief, or non-belief, has replaced much of our civilizational questioning. Internal questioning has been substituted with a new form of cultural obedience, internal persuasion from without. When all major global, governmental and human management systems are founded on untruths and blatant misconceptions, then the problem stems from the core of the system itself and infuses outwards into the people. Deception is the blood of the current cultural beast. Within such a system, the only end to nihilism is tyranny and totalitarianism. Any revolution born out of apathy and existential angst will only feed the false kingdom of this world. It has happened before. Tyrannical regimes such as fascism and National Socialism exploited the sense of restlessness to feed into their own purposes and agenda of authoritarianism. It is because nihilism produces, or is produced from, an inner disquiet that people become unmoored from their grounding and start to drift, and are then much more susceptible to forces of mass formation and false solidarity, as so clearly shown by the work of psychologist Matthias Desmet. Furthermore, this itching sense of disquiet is often covered up through the seeking of activities and distractions that provide a temporary sense of well-being. This is the opportune time for certain pseudo-spiritualities, or new spiritualities, to claim a sway of new clients. It is a time for magicians dressed in robes of quantum entanglement to proclaim the oneness and cosmic connectivity of all. Anything to escape from the restlessness and meaninglessness of a materially empty existence. According to Seraphim Rose, the spectre of nihilism has already arrived at our shores. Quote, "Nihilism has become, in our time, so widespread and pervasive, has entered so thoroughly and so deeply into the minds and hearts of all men living today, that there is no longer any front on which it may be fought, and those who think they are fighting it are most often using its own weapons, which they in effect turn against themselves." End quote. This nihilism has become pervasive because there is no longer any relationship, either tangible or non-tangible, to even relative truths. The religious, spiritual, cultural, even political ropes of attachment have become irretrievably severed. The only hope that has been offered in the place of the void is technological, a techno-materialism promoted as the machine of ultimate progress. The artificial construct is being praised as the new authenticity. As philosopher Walter Benjamin would say, we now live within the age, or cage, of mechanical reproduction. There is no desire or wish for a return to the old authority systems. There is a fast grab for the replacement. And within this void of desperation, people will be almost willing for a new great reset. The deepening materialism of the digital age or cage is constructing a false playground out of the increased dismantling of all the prior structures of morality and ordered meanings. The pandemic and post-pandemic pressure forced more and more people into online and digital lifestyles. The rising management systems of the carbon-controlled so-called green economy will further establish an architecture of monitored and curated needs. This emerging architecture of control is what I have referred to as the machinic impulse, and it takes the pre-existing forms of nihilism to a new level. The nihilism that existed prior to our current times was a rejection of moral and or religious principles, and a feeling or philosophical perspective that nothing in the world has a real existence or meaning. However, our consensus reality has been and continues to be manipulated, so the normal state of affairs is now a world of deep fakes, post-truth and narrative manipulation, until we are not sure if the world has a real existence at the best of times. The nihilism that the encroaching era of deep materialism is creating is what can be called as neo-nihilism. Neo-nihilism can be viewed as constant uncertainty and untruths disguised as knowledge when it is nothing more than a power control structure. This neo-nihilism is, I would posit, a loss of meaning and reality grounding through a new technological world order that strips a person of any sense of inner being and triggers various unseen neuroses. Psychoanalysis tells us that neurosis is part of the humanization process, the limitation of experience, the fragmentation of perception, the dispossession of internal control. In other words, it is a falling away from one's being, a decenteredness, a lack of a moral spirit center. This inner void creates disorientation. It is not a social, cultural, or a political nihilism, but a psychological one. It is a denial and disbelief centered around the same thing, a nothingness or zero space. Out of this zero space may arise a techno-mediated world of the absurd, a machinic rationality that becomes the new irrational form of narrative. This new irrational narrative would have the aim of becoming the next form of world structure. However, it is necessary first to dismantle the old narratives that held the old order together. In terms of a power structure, it would be better to crush the old narratives so that their remnants do not try to rise up to confront the new programming. This was seen with the National Socialism of the Nazis. It wasn't only a physical new order, but also, importantly, a psychological one. The new order must dethrone its imagined enemies to declare a new security state or world order of security. A new form of organization is coming into existence that represents this neo-nihilistic era of the dying cultural age. It represents a kind of lucid absurdity where technique and precision are paramount and displays an appalling insensitivity toward the human and the being of humanity. This neo-nihilistic form of organization corresponds to a terraforming and transformation of the earth and society by machines, artificial intelligence, and the inhuman ideology of social management and engineering that accompanies it. Its aim is to become a highly centralized power regime that consumes all forms of knowledge and truth divergent to its own ideological narratives. Quote, "For if there is no truth, power knows no limit save that imposed by the medium in which it functions, or by a stronger power opposed to it." Unquote. The ideological narrative, from the neo-nihilistic power structure's point of view, will be one of perfect rationality and technological progress that provides for a world of total liberation. Yet it shall be a materialist's pseudo-utopia, for in truth it will be the vastest and most efficient digital iron cage humans have ever known, for it will be pervasive and untouchable. Yet this is not the most worrying issue. The more disturbing aspect here is that there is a power drive to establish the organization for a new Earth that is opposed to the cyclic evolutionary impulses. The core object of this project is for a transformation of humankind into a new planetary species body. It shall be a planetary species greatly reduced in number and highly segregated by status and servitude. And most importantly, it will be based on a collective humanized mass that functions at a lower vibration of being and self. In other words, a great planetary change is coming to the Earth as the planet and human civilization transits from one cycle into another. And a small number of wealthy and powerful individuals with immense hubris are attempting to manage and steer this transition to favor their materialistic goals at the expense of the many. At the end of a grand cycle, there is generally a sense of psychic malaise, as well as a breakdown in mental cohesion and harmony. This phase accumulates a lot of psychic and emotional energy that can be utilized as part of the divergence, for better or for worse. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who perhaps recognized this condition better than others, said that under certain circumstances, quote, "Nihilism might be the sign of a process of incisive and most essential growth and of mankind's transit into completely new conditions of existence." End quote. This sign of growth is because the human being, the new mutation, is rootless, discontinuous with a past that is being dismantled and destroyed, and is eager for the new apocalypse, i.e. a revelation, to emerge in its place. And yet, there are simultaneously forces pushing to create the mass-minded collective as opposed to the individualized person. The new human of the de-evolutionary path will be a reduced version of themselves, the robo-sapien that is the profane human being. Before human civilization arrives at that juncture, what some have termed as the bifurcation, there is the increasing danger of a rising incoherence that paralyzes people between the extremes of external power and an increasing internal powerlessness. This encroaching lucid absurdity is like the emperor's new clothes, where very few people are recognizing the blatant incongruity of our mainstream narratives, and so there is almost no one around to ask the question as to how we can transcend the perceptual limits of the world. It would seem that a certain form of inner truth is required for such an enterprise. Such times of neo-nihilism, a form of ideological and spiritual purposelessness, is when things fall apart because they no longer have any center to hold them together, and yet a form of daily life continues. The external events of any age are a projection of humanity's inner state and psyche, only that at certain times this collective condition becomes more visible upon the world stage. During the cycle of transition or transmutation, of cultural death and rebirth, there are fewer commonly accepted points of orientation, and the compass no longer has a magnetic north. In times of changing magnetics, people are more eager to adopt the obedience to security as an easy external dependency. And yet, nihilism, insecurity, meaninglessness, and a lack of purpose are not the cause, but the symptoms. The orientation of the individual is an internal question rather than an external one. The individual has to come to their own sense of coherence. In the words of Václav Havel, quote, "The principles of control and discipline ought to be abandoned in favor of self-control and self-discipline." End quote. The self, both the smaller and the higher self, has to come to the fore. Otherwise, an individual is lost to the energetic forces of massification and external manipulation. As we enter these times of transmutation, we shall be called upon to exhibit our self-control and self-discipline if we are to recalibrate our own state of body, mind, and being. For these are vital times as we make the choice whether we physically and psychically extricate ourselves from the negating forces of chaos and step into a new cycle for humanity.